Hi, I'm Jack, and I am here at the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon here in Northern Virginia. I am here to explore the history of the Electoral College and what impact it has had on citizens and on presidential elections. But hold up, rewind. What exactly is the Electoral College? The Electoral College is a process, not a place, that we use to select the president and vice president. Electors serve as go-betweens during an election. They use the popular vote from their state to cast their ballots. A candidate needs 270 electoral votes to win a presidential election. So I'm going to start my journey with speaking to Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, a presidential historian and the executive director of this library. So I was just interested about how exactly the Electoral College was founded.
It's a great question. So the Electoral College didn't really come from this great idea. By the end of the summer of 1787, the framers at the Constitutional Convention were tired and they were hot and they were grouchy and they wanted to go home. And so there was this committee, which was called the Committee of Postponed Matters or Unfinished Parts, which I think is a great name for a committee. And they came up with this idea, which they called the Electoral College, which basically meant that each state would have representation and each state would decide how they would pick their electors. And that way, the people wouldn't necessarily be deciding who the president was, but every state would have a voice and no big state or small state would be able to dominate.
And were there any drastic changes to the Electoral College from back then to what we see today?
Early on with George Washington, because he was unanimously elected twice, the only president ever to have done so, the Electoral College didn't have all that much impact. But very quickly, it began to have an impact with the election of 1796 and then 1800, and the 12th Amendment was passed after the tie in the election of 1800. They essentially cast separate votes for the president and the vice president so that there would never be a tie between people who were intended for different offices.
Dr. Chervinsky took me to the vault where they keep special documents and artifacts.
This document is called the Acts of Congress. After George Washington's first year of his presidency, he had a copy of the Constitution and all of the laws that were passed during the first session of Congress printed and bound in a really beautiful volume. And what I love about it, a couple of things. Here you can see where it's actually describing the process of electing the president. So they don't use the words Electoral College, but they do talk about the electors. But it's also really neat because he wrote in the margins, which is not something he usually did. Here he's talking about presidential powers and things that are required of him, including giving updates to Congress, which we call the State of the Union today.
While at Mount Vernon, I also learned that the Electoral College was heavily shaped by slavery. To increase their electoral voting power, Southern states pushed to count all enslaved people in their states even though they were not allowed to vote. Expansion of voting rights wouldn't begin until after the Civil War. To learn more about that future expansion, I went to the University of Richmond School of Law to meet with Professor Henry L. Chambers. When the enslaved people were freed, what was the impact on the Electoral College and even our Constitution?
When we think about the Reconstruction Amendments, which were passed in the wake of the Civil War, those amendments abolished slavery, made former slaves citizens of the United States, and the 15th Amendment gave black men the ability to vote.
I understand there have been significant reform in who can vote, especially when women were able to vote, lowering the age of which people can vote, when black people were able to vote. How have they played a significant impact into the Electoral College and our elections to this day?
The very concept of voting has changed over time, but the idea that folks who were enslaved were allowed to vote fairly soon after the Civil War made people think that maybe we ought to think about more people voting rather than few. Men of color had the right to vote. That was functionally taken away by a lot of states in the late 1800s. And then we get to the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s, which brought those rights back. And that's sort of the story of America. Sometimes we take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But hopefully, at the end of the day, we move toward equality, equal voting rights, and fairness for all.
After talking with Dr. Chervinsky and Professor Chambers, I've learned so much more about the state of our Electoral College and our political parties. I really want to pursue a career in government or law, so I think it's really important that I know how we choose who represents us and who represents the American people. Thank you so much for coming along with me on this journey. See you again next time. Bye.